Nothing hurts worse than your own blood turning their backs on you. Silas Creed had carried that pain for 15 years, living alone in the mountains after his family called him too wild to stay. When his grandfather Ezra died and left him an old house, Silas figured it was just another empty gesture. He walked through that dusty place, expecting nothing but old memories and regret. Then he found the loose floorboard in the parlor. Hidden underneath were journals that told him everything his family never said. Ezra hadn't abandoned him. He'd been watching over him all along. The old man had seen something special in Silas that nobody else could see. He'd been preparing him for something important his whole life. But what was his grandfather really getting him ready for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like memories that wouldn't let go. Silas Creed stood on the weathered porch of his grandfather's house, watching the sun paint the pine tops gold, while the coffee in his tin cup grew cold. 3 days had passed since he'd first opened those journals, and sleep had become a stranger. Every creak of the old timber, every whisper of wind through the eaves seemed to carry Ezra's voice, patient knowing, waiting for understanding to dawn. The house itself told stories in a language Silas was only beginning to learn. Built solid from hand-hewn logs in 1889, it had weathered 47 winters without bending. Ezra had added to it over the decades, a reading nook by the east window where morning light fell just right, a workshop in the back where the smell of pine shavings and linseed oil still lingered, a root cellar dug deep enough to keep provisions through the harshest months. Everything had purpose. Nothing was wasted or careless. The inheritance letter had been brief, just a few lines from a lawyer in Billings stating that Ezra Creed had left his property to his grandson, along with all contents and personal effects therein. Silas had expected maybe some old furniture, perhaps a rifle or two, maybe enough to sell for provisions through another winter. He hadn't expected to find a life's work waiting for him. The journals filled an entire cedar chest beneath the parlor floorboards. 43 volumes in all, dating back to 1923, when Ezra first came to this mountain valley as a young man with little more than determination and a solid pair of hands. Each volume was meticulously kept, written in the precise script of a man who understood that words mattered, that recording truth was a sacred duty. But these weren't just the musings of an old mountain man. They were detailed observations of the land, the seasons, the wildlife patterns that governed life in the high country. Ezra had documented everything, which springs ran cold in drought years, where the game trails shifted when deep snows came early, how to read the sky for weather changes that could mean the difference between life and death. More than that, he'd recorded the stories of every family that had tried to make a life in this unforgiving country, their successes and failures, their wisdom and mistakes. Silas found his own name scattered throughout the later volumes, entries that began when he was still a boy running wild through these same forests during summer visits. "The boy sees what others miss," Ezra had written when Silas was 12. Tracks a wounded deer for 3 miles through deadfall, where grown men would lose the trail. Reads the land like it speaks to him in plain English. The entries grew more frequent after Silas's family had cast him out. His father, Marcus Creed, had inherited the family's sawmill operation down in Timber Falls, along with their respectable standing in the community. But respectability and wilderness blood didn't mix well. And when Silas started getting into scrapes, fighting with town boys who called him half-wild, disappearing into the mountains for days at a time, showing up to school with mud on his boots and pine needles in his hair, Marcus had made his choice clear. "You're too much like your grandfather," his father had said that last bitter morning, "and I won't have you dragging this family's name through the dirt anymore." Silas's mother, Elizabeth, had stood silent in the kitchen doorway, her face a mask of resignation and quiet grief. His younger sister, Rebecca, had watched from the stairs, tears streaming down her cheeks as her older brother packed his few belongings into a worn canvas satchel. The only words of comfort had come from his grandmother, Sarah, who pressed Ezra's old winter coat into his hands and whispered, "Your grandfather sees something in you that the rest of us are too blind to notice. Trust in that." But Ezra's journals revealed a different story entirely. Far from being disappointed in his grandson's exile, the old man had been watching, planning, preparing. "Marcus fears what he doesn't understand," one entry read. "The boy carries the old ways in his blood, the knowledge that built this country before cities and conveniences made men soft. He needs time to learn who he is without their expectations weighing him down." Entry after entry detailed Ezra's quiet observations of Silas's mountain life. How he'd built his first shelter using traditional methods no one had taught him. How he'd learned to track game in all seasons, to read weather patterns, to find water in drought conditions. How he'd developed the kind of self-reliance that couldn't be learned in schools or inherited from books. "The family thinks they're protecting their reputation," Ezra had written 5 years ago. "They don't understand they're protecting the boy from their limitations. Out there, he's becoming what this bloodline was meant to produce, a man who can thrive where others merely survive." The workshop behind the house held even more revelations. Ezra had been crafting something for decades. Hand-forged tools, carefully preserved seeds from heritage crops, detailed maps of water sources and game trails, weather records going back 60 years. Everything a man would need to not just survive in the wilderness, but to build something lasting, to create a life that could weather any storm. But the most significant discovery waited in a locked wooden box on Ezra's workbench. The key hung on a leather cord tucked inside the final journal, along with a letter addressed simply to "the boy who became a man." Inside the box, wrapped in oiled leather, was a deed. Not just to the house and its immediate grounds, but to nearly 3,000 acres of prime mountain valley, timber rights, mineral rights, water rights, all included. Land that had been in the Creed family since the 1890s. Land that Silas's father had assumed would pass to him as the eldest son. The letter explained everything in Ezra's careful script. "Your father is a good man, but he was born for a different kind of life. Town living suits him. Business dealings and social standing matter to him in ways they never mattered to me. But you, boy, you were born for this place. You understand that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in knowledge, in capability, in the ability to provide for those you love, no matter what storms come." Ezra had spent 40 years accumulating not just land, but knowledge. The journals contained detailed instructions for everything from building water wheels to smoking meat, from predicting harsh winters to finding medicinal plants. He'd created a library of practical wisdom that could sustain a family through any crisis. But there was more. The final pages of the last journal spoke of changes coming to the valley, of developers from the east who'd been quietly buying up failing homesteads, of government men asking questions about mineral surveys and timber assessments. Ezra had seen the future approaching, a future where places like this would become increasingly valuable, where the old ways of living would be either preserved by those who understood their worth or swept aside by those who saw only profit. "I leave you more than land," the letter concluded. "I leave you purpose. This valley and everything in it is your inheritance, but more than that, it's your responsibility. The knowledge I've gathered, the skills I've preserved, the ways of living that built strong families and stronger communities, they're yours to carry forward. Use them well, boy. Use them to build something that will last." Silas set down the final journal as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks. The weight of his grandfather's trust settled on his shoulders like that old winter coat, heavy with responsibility, but warm with purpose. For 15 years, he'd thought himself cast out, abandoned, forced to make his own way in a world that had no place for him. Now, he understood the truth. He hadn't been cast out at all. He'd been prepared. The mountain wind picked up, sending dry leaves skittering across the porch boards. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as it rode the thermals high above the tree line. Silas pulled his grandfather's coat tighter around his shoulders and smiled for the first time in memory. Tomorrow, he would begin the work Ezra had prepared him for. Tonight, he would plan. The inheritance was more than land and timber. It was a chance to prove that some things were worth preserving, worth fighting for, worth building a life around. And for the first time since that bitter morning when his family turned their backs on him, Silas Creed felt like he was exactly where he belonged. The riders came at dawn on Silas's fourth day at the house, their horses' hooves drumming against the frost-hardened ground like distant thunder. 3 men in expensive clothes that had no business in mountain country, led by a 4th whose bearing suggested he was accustomed to getting his way. Silas watched them approach from the kitchen window. His grandfather's journals spread across the worn oak table behind him. He'd been reading about boundary markers, how Ezra had spent decades carefully documenting every stone cairn, every blazed tree, every survey stake that defined the Creed family holdings. The old man had been meticulous about such things, understanding that in country where neighbors might be separated by miles of rough terrain, clear boundaries meant the difference between peace and conflict. The lead rider was a tall man, with silver hair and clothes that probably cost more than most folks in the valley saw in a year. He dismounted with the easy confidence of someone who'd never been told no and expected today wouldn't be any different. The other 3 stayed mounted, their hands resting casually near their coat fronts in a way that suggested they carried more than just papers. Silas stepped onto the porch, noting how the morning mist seemed to part around these men like water around stones. The lead rider smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Mr. Creed, I presume. My name is Harrison Blackwood of Blackwood Development Corporation." The man's voice carried the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to making offers that sounded generous, but left others holding nothing. "I'm sorry for your recent loss. Your grandfather was quite a character in these parts." Silas said nothing, just leaned against the porch rail and waited. Ezra's journals had taught him that silence often revealed more than questions ever could. Blackwood seemed to take this as invitation to continue. "I'll come straight to the point, Mr. Creed. My company has been acquiring properties throughout this valley for a significant development project, a luxury resort and recreational community that will bring considerable prosperity to this region. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for your grandfather's property." "Not interested," Silas said quietly. The smile never wavered. "I understand your attachment to the family homestead, but I think you'll find our offer quite compelling. $800,000 for the house and all acreage. Cash settlement within 30 days. Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. 800,000 was more money than he'd ever imagined, enough to buy a comfortable life anywhere he chose. But something in Blackwood's manner, the way his companions sat their horses like men, ready for trouble, made every instinct Ezra had helped him develop start sending warnings. "Property's not for sale," Silas replied. Blackwood's smile finally faltered. "Mr. Creed, I don't think you understand the scope of what we're discussing here. This valley is changing whether you participate or not. We already own 17 properties in the immediate area. Your land is unfortunately positioned right in the center of our development zone. Then you have a problem." One of the mounted men shifted in his saddle, and Silas caught the flash of steel beneath his coat. These weren't just business associates. They were enforcers dressed up in suits. "Let me be clearer," Blackwood continued, his voice losing its smooth edge. "We've done extensive surveys of this area. Your grandfather's property sits on one of the largest freshwater aquifers in the state, not to mention prime timber and potential mineral rights. This isn't just about a few acres of mountain land. This is about resources that could benefit thousands of people." Silas thought about the journals, about Ezra's careful documentation of every spring, every stand of timber, every mineral indication he'd found over 40 years of living on this land. The old man had known exactly what he was sitting on, and he'd known that knowledge made him a target. "Still not for sale," Silas said. Blackwood's facade cracked completely. Mr. Creed, you're being unreasonable. We're offering you a fortune for land that's essentially worthless in its current state. Raw wilderness that produces nothing, supports nothing, benefits no one, seems to have supported my grandfather just fine for 40 years. Your grandfather was one man living in primitive conditions. We're talking about creating something that could employ hundreds of people, generate millions in tax revenue, put this entire region on the map economically. Silas stepped down from the porch, moving slowly but deliberately. The mounted men tensed, hands moving closer to their weapons. But there was something in Silas's bearing, the easy confidence of a man who'd spent 15 years learning to survive in country that killed the unprepared, that made them hesitate. Mr. Blackwood, Silas said quietly, I think you should leave now. This isn't over. Creed, we have legal options. Environmental assessments, eminent domain procedures, ways of acquiring property that's essential to public development projects. That sounds like a threat. Blackwood remounted his horse with considerably less grace than he'd dismounted. It's a promise. This valley is going to be developed with or without your cooperation. The only question is whether you profit from that development or become an obstacle to it. The four riders turned and headed back down the mountain trail, leaving Silas standing in the morning stillness with his mind racing. He'd expected challenges to his inheritance, family disputes, maybe legal complications from taxes or unclear titles. He hadn't expected corporate raiders with armed escorts making barely veiled threats about eminent domain. Back inside the house, he returned to Ezra's journals with new urgency. Now he was looking for specific information, property surveys, mineral assessments, water rights documentation. What he found made his blood run cold. Ezra had been tracking Blackwood Development Corporation for over 3 years. The company had been quietly acquiring properties throughout the region, always following the same pattern. First came generous cash offers, then came pressure, tax assessments that mysteriously increased, environmental citations for minor infractions, building code violations that required expensive remediation. Finally came the legal challenges. Eminent domain claims, utility easement disputes, zoning changes that made traditional land use impossible. The old man had documented 17 families who'd lost their land to Blackwood's methods. Good people who'd worked the same ground for generations. Forced out by a combination of financial pressure and legal maneuvering that left them with no choice but to sell for whatever they could get. But Ezra had also been preparing for this confrontation. Hidden in a compartment behind the workshop's wood stove, Silas found detailed surveys proving the Creed family's clear title to not just the house and immediate grounds, but to water rights that predated any subsequent claims. More importantly, he found correspondence with a lawyer in Helena, a man named Thomas Whitmore, who specialized in defending property rights against corporate acquisition. The final piece of Ezra's preparation was the most sobering. A loaded Winchester rifle, carefully maintained and equipped with a scope, along with enough ammunition to fight a small war. Beside it lay a simple note in Ezra's handwriting. Some things are worth fighting for. Some battles choose you whether you want them or not. Silas understood now why his grandfather had spent so many years teaching him to read the land, to understand weather patterns and game trails, to move through wilderness without leaving signs of his passage. Ezra hadn't just been preserving traditional skills, he'd been preparing his grandson for a war that was coming whether they wanted it or not. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing the valley in all its stark beauty. Somewhere down the mountain, Harrison Blackwood was already making phone calls, setting legal wheels in motion, preparing to prove that one man couldn't stand against progress and profit. But Silas Creed was no longer just one man. He was the inheritor of 40 years of preparation, the keeper of knowledge that ran deeper than corporate spreadsheets or development plans. And he was discovering that some inheritances came with the obligation to fight for them. The war for Ezra Creed's mountain had begun. The letter from Thomas Whitmore arrived 2 days after Blackwood's visit. delivered by a postal rider who seemed nervous about venturing so far into the high country. Silas recognized the lawyer's name from Ezra's correspondence, a man his grandfather had trusted enough to share his deepest concerns about the coming battle for the valley. Whitmore's message was direct and sobering. Blackwood Development had already filed preliminary paperwork for eminent domain proceedings, claiming the Creed property was essential for a public works project of significant economic benefit to the region. They'd also submitted environmental impact studies suggesting that private ownership of such a large watershed posed risks to downstream communities. Your grandfather prepared for this fight better than most, the letter continued. But preparation and victory are different things. We need to meet immediately to discuss your options. More importantly, we need to understand exactly what you're inheriting before Blackwood's lawyers find ways to take it from you. Silas spent the morning studying Ezra's maps with new intensity. The old man had marked every feature of the 3,000-acre property: springs, timber stands, mineral deposits, game trails, seasonal water patterns. But one marking kept drawing his attention: a series of small X's following a path that led deep into the property's most remote section, ending at what Ezra had labeled simply as the cache. He'd noticed the markings before, but assumed they indicated hunting spots or fishing holes. Now, understanding the scope of what his grandfather had been preparing for, Silas suspected they marked something far more significant. The trail began behind the house, following an old deer path that climbed steadily through dense pine forest. Ezra had blazed trees along the route with subtle marks that would be invisible to casual observers, but clear to anyone who knew how to read them. After an hour of steady climbing, the path opened into a hidden meadow where a natural spring fed a small pond. Here, hidden beneath carefully arranged stones and camouflaged by decades of natural growth, Silas found his grandfather's greatest secret. The cache was enormous, a natural cave system that Ezra had expanded and reinforced over years of patient work. The main chamber was large enough to stable horses and store equipment for months. Side chambers held everything a man would need to survive indefinitely: preserved food, medical supplies, tools, weapons, ammunition, even books and maps detailing every approach to the valley. But the most significant discovery was in the deepest chamber, a complete workshop equipped with everything needed to maintain weapons, repair equipment, and even communicate with the outside world. A modern radio system, carefully maintained and regularly tested according to log sheets Ezra had kept until just weeks before his death. Silas found himself holding a leather journal labeled Operational Plans. Inside, his grandfather had detailed strategies for defending the property against various threats: legal challenges, economic pressure, and, if necessary, direct confrontation. The old man had studied military tactics, guerrilla warfare principles, even historical accounts of successful resistance against overwhelming odds. The land chooses its own defenders, Ezra had written on the journal's first page. It tests them, shapes them, prepares them for the battles that matter. You didn't run away from your family, boy. You ran toward your true purpose. Reading those words in the hidden chamber, surrounded by 40 years of preparation and planning, Silas finally understood the full scope of his inheritance. This wasn't just about preserving family land or protecting water rights. Ezra had recognized that what was happening in this valley was part of something larger, a pattern of exploitation that was spreading across the entire region, turning family holdings into corporate assets and traditional communities into managed developments. The radio crackled to life, startling him from his thoughts. A voice emerged from the static, calm, professional, with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to tactical communications. Base to Creed Station. Do you copy? Base to Creed Station. Silas hesitated, then picked up the handset. This is Creed Station. Silas, this is Tom Whitmore. Your grandfather set up this communication protocol years ago. Are you secure? I'm at the cache. Good. then you understand what you're really dealing with. Blackwood isn't just another development company. They're part of a consortium that's been systematically acquiring resource-rich properties across 3 states. What they're doing in your valley, they've done in dozens of other locations. Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. How many families have they displaced over the past 5 years? Hundreds. They have the process down to a science. Financial pressure, legal manipulation, and when those fail, more direct methods of persuasion. Your grandfather wasn't the only one preparing for this fight. The radio went quiet for a moment, then Whitmore continued. There are others, Silas. Property owners who've decided to make a stand. People who understand that what's being lost is more than just land. It's a way of life that took generations to build. Your grandfather was the focal point of a network that spans most of the mountain regions. What kind of network? Families who've learned to defend what's theirs. People who understand that sometimes the law isn't enough. That sometimes you have to be willing to fight for what you believe in. Your grandfather spent 20 years building relationships with folks who think like he did. Silas studied the maps spread across the workshop table, seeing them now with new understanding. The markings weren't just features of his own property. They showed connection points to neighboring holdings, communication routes, supply caches, defensive positions that could control access to the entire valley. Whitmore, what am I really inheriting here? The leadership of the most effective resistance movement in the region. Your grandfather wasn't just protecting his own land. He was building a coalition that could protect everyone's land. But that coalition needs someone who understands the country, someone who can move through it like it's his backyard, someone the others will trust and follow. The weight of responsibility settled on Silas's shoulders like his grandfather's old coat, heavy but somehow right. He thought about Blackwood's threats, about the 17 families who'd already lost their homes, about the way the suited men had sat their horses like occupying soldiers. What's the next move? First, we meet. There's a gathering tomorrow night. Property owners from throughout the valley. People who've been waiting to see if Ezra's grandson was cut from the same cloth as the old man. They need to see what you're made of. Where? The old Miller place, about 15 miles southeast of your position. Your grandfather's maps will show you the route. And Silas, come prepared. These folks have been pushed to the edge. They're looking for someone who can lead them back from it. The radio went silent, leaving Silas alone in the hidden chamber with the full weight of his inheritance settling around him. He wasn't just inheriting land and buildings and family history. He was inheriting a war that had been building for years, and the expectation that he would know how to fight it. Outside the cave, evening shadows were already stretching across the meadow. Soon it would be dark. And tomorrow he would meet the people who'd been waiting for him to become the man his grandfather had prepared him to be. For the first time since discovering the journals, Silas felt the magnitude of what was expected of him. The old Miller place sat in a natural bowl surrounded by dense timber, invisible from any road or trail unless you knew exactly where to look. Silas found it using his grandfather's detailed maps, following game trails and creek beds that wound through country so rough that even experienced outdoorsmen would think twice about attempting passage after dark. As he approached the weathered homestead, he could see lights flickering through the windows and trucks hidden beneath camouflage tarps in the surrounding trees. These people understood operational security in ways that spoke of hard-earned experience. The front door opened before he could knock, revealing a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. She wore practical clothes and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent decades making difficult decisions in unforgiving country. "You'd be Ezra's boy," she said, extending a calloused hand. "Mary Miller, your grandfather spoke of you often." Inside, the main room was filled with people who looked like they'd stepped from a different era, men and women weathered by mountain. Living, wearing clothes chosen for durability rather than fashion. But their eyes held the sharp intelligence of folks who'd learned to read situations quickly and accurately. These weren't simple mountain dwellers, they were strategists. Thomas Whitmore stood near the fireplace, a man in his 50s with the bearing of someone accustomed to fighting legal battles against overwhelming odds. When he saw Silas, he nodded respectfully. "Gentlemen, ladies, Silas Creed." The conversations in the room quieted as 23 pairs of eyes turned to assess the man they'd been waiting to meet. Silas felt the weight of their expectations, their hopes, their carefully guarded trust. These people had known his grandfather for decades. They'd watched from a distance as Silas built his reputation in the high country. Now, they needed to know if he was worthy of the legacy he'd inherited. An older man with a grey beard stepped forward. Jim Patterson, according to Ezra's notes, a rancher who'd been fighting Blackwood's advances for 2 years. "Your grandfather was the smartest man in this valley," Patterson said quietly. "He saw what was coming long before the rest of us. Question is, did he teach you what you need to know?" Silas pulled out the operational journal he'd found in the cache, setting it on the room's central table. "He taught me to read the land, to understand that knowledge is more valuable than money, and to recognize when something's worth fighting for." Mary Miller picked up the journal, scanning the pages with obvious familiarity. "Ezra shared pieces of this with all of us over the years, but none of us have seen the complete plan. That's because the complete plan required someone who could move through this country like Ezra did," Whitmore said. "Someone who understood every trail, every water source, every defensive position. Someone the land itself had tested and approved." A younger woman spoke up from the back of the room, Sarah Chen, who'd inherited her family's timber operation 3 years earlier. "Blackwood made their offer to us last month. When we refused, suddenly we had EPA investigators claiming our logging practices were damaging watershed areas. Same investigators who've never complained about the clear-cutting operations. Blackwood's been running on the properties they've already acquired. They offered us $400,000. For land that's been in my family since 1892, added Patterson. When I laughed at them, they informed me that property tax assessments for the entire district were being reviewed. My taxes tripled overnight. Silas listened to story after story, families driven off land their grandparents had homesteaded, traditional businesses regulated out of existence, young people forced to move away because there was no longer any way to make a living from the country their ancestors had settled. Blackwood's pattern was clear and devastating. "What's their real objective?" Silas asked. Whitmore spread a large map across the table, marking properties Blackwood had already acquired with red pins. The pattern was unmistakable. They were systematically gaining control of every major water source in the region. "Water rights," he said simply. "Everything else is secondary. The luxury resort development is just the public face of what they're really after. They're acquiring control of the largest freshwater reserves in 3 states. For what? Speculation. Climate change projections show this region becoming increasingly valuable as drought conditions spread across the Southwest. Water that's worth pennies per gallon today could be worth dollars per gallon within a decade." Mary Miller pointed to a cluster of blue pins on the map. "Your grandfather's property controls the headwaters for most of the springs and streams in this valley. Blackwood can't complete their water monopoly without it." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about preserving family homesteads or traditional ways of life. It was about preventing corporate control of resources that entire communities depended on for survival. "Ezra's plan assumes they'll escalate beyond legal pressure," Whitmore continued. "His intelligence sources suggest Blackwood has used more direct methods in other locations. Equipment sabotage, mysterious fires, incidents that couldn't be proven, but convinced reluctant sellers to accept whatever offer was on the table." Silas studied the faces around the room. Good people who'd worked hard their entire lives, who'd built something meaningful in country that demanded everything from those who chose to call it home. They weren't looking for a fight, but they understood that sometimes fights found you whether you wanted them or not. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Patterson leaned forward. Leadership, coordination, someone who can move through this country in all weather, who knows every trail and hiding place, who can keep us connected when they try to isolate us. Your grandfather spent 20 years preparing for this, Mary Miller added. But preparation without action is just planning to lose slowly. We need someone willing to turn those plans into reality. Silas thought about the cash, about the weapons and supplies Ezra had accumulated, about the radio network that connected isolated properties across hundreds of square miles of rough country. His grandfather had built the foundation for resistance. Now it was up to him to decide whether to build on that foundation or let it crumble. How long do we have? Blackwood's legal challenges will take months to work through the courts, Whitmore replied. But their other methods tend to escalate quickly once they realize they're facing organized opposition instead of individual families who can be isolated and pressured. The room waited for his answer. Outside, the mountain wind had picked up, carrying the scent of coming snow. Winter was approaching, and with it the season when travel became difficult, and isolated homesteads became vulnerable to those who preferred to work in darkness. Then, "We'd better get started," Silas said. The first real test came 3 weeks later when Patterson's barn burned to the ground on a windless night. The fire marshal ruled it electrical, but the scorch patterns told a different story to anyone who knew how to read them. Silas found boot prints in the soft earth behind the structure, expensive boots that had no business in ranch country, leading to tire tracks from a vehicle that had approached through timber where no road existed. He radioed the information to the network using the communication protocols Ezra had established. Within hours, every property owner in the valley knew they were no longer dealing with legal pressure and economic coercion. Blackwood had escalated to direct action. The response was swift and coordinated. Sarah Chen discovered surveillance equipment near her timber operation the next morning, high-end cameras hidden in trees along the access road. The Miller place found strangers conducting environmental surveys on adjacent public land, positioning themselves to observe comings and goings at the old homestead. But Silas had advantages that Blackwood's corporate operators couldn't match. He knew every game trail, every hidden approach, every vantage point in thousands of acres of mountain wilderness. More importantly, he'd spent 15 years learning to move through that wilderness without leaving traces of his passage. He began a systematic campaign of counter-surveillance, documenting every attempt at monitoring or infiltration. The radio system became invaluable, coded messages that allowed the network to track Blackwood's movements in real time and coordinate responses that stayed just within the boundaries of legal self-defense. The significant discovery came when Silas found Blackwood's forward operating base, a hunting cabin, deep in the national forest that had been quietly leased and converted into a staging area for their operations. Hidden equipment revealed the scope of their surveillance: telephoto cameras, listening devices, even aerial drones capable of long-range reconnaissance. But the most troubling discovery was a detailed file on every family in the resistance network. Blackwood's intelligence was thorough and personal. Financial records, family histories, psychological profiles that identified each person's vulnerabilities and pressure points. They knew which families had children away at college, which had elderly relatives requiring expensive medical care, which were struggling with debt or health problems that made them susceptible to economic pressure. Silas photographed everything using equipment from Ezra's cache, then retreated without disturbing the site. The intelligence he'd gathered would be crucial for protecting the network, but more importantly, it revealed the level of resources Blackwood was willing to commit to acquiring the valley's water rights. That evening, he called an emergency gathering at the cache itself. The natural amphitheater could accommodate the entire network while remaining completely hidden from outside observation. As the families arrived through hidden trails, using movement protocols Ezra had developed over decades, Silas understood he was witnessing something remarkable. A community that had learned to function as a coordinated resistance organization while maintaining the appearance of ordinary rural life. Their Not just monitoring us, he reported, displaying the photographs he'd taken. They're building psychological profiles designed to identify our breaking points. They know exactly how much pressure each family can handle before they fold. Mary Miller studied the files with obvious concern. This level of intelligence gathering suggests they're planning something more sophisticated than barn fires and intimidation. Thomas Whitmore nodded grimly. Corporate acquisition specialists. They analyze target populations the same way military planners analyze enemy forces, identify key leaders, map relationship networks, determine which pressure points will cause maximum disruption with minimal exposure. What's their timeline? Asked Patterson, still bitter about losing 40 years of accumulated equipment and feed in the barn fire. Silas pulled out a planning document he'd photographed. According to this, they're preparing for what they call accelerated acquisition procedures, beginning after the first significant snowfall. They want the legal challenges moving through the courts while they apply direct pressure to the holdout properties. Why wait for snow? Sarah Chen asked. Isolation, Silas replied. Winter makes these properties more vulnerable, harder for law enforcement to reach. Easier to blame incidents on weather conditions or seasonal hazards, and it gives them months of reduced visibility to work in. The implications were sobering. Winter in the high country could last from November through April, nearly 6 months when normal support systems became unreliable and isolated. Homesteads depended entirely on their own resources. Your grandfather anticipated this, Whitmore said, consulting his own notes. His plans assume Blackwood would eventually move beyond economic pressure to direct action designed to make continued residence untenable. Silas opened the operational journal to a section he'd been studying intensively. Ezra outlined 3 phases of resistance. Phase 1 was intelligence gathering and network building. That's what we've been doing. Phase 2 is active defense, protecting our properties and families while documenting illegal activities for eventual prosecution. And Phase 3, Mary Miller asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Direct action. If legal remedies fail and defensive measures prove insufficient, Ezra's plans assume we'll need to make continued operations so costly and dangerous that Blackwood decides to find easier targets. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. These were peaceful people who'd chosen mountain living precisely because it allowed them to avoid the conflicts and complications of modern life. But they were also people who understood that some things were worth fighting for, and that sometimes fighting was the only option left. Patterson broke the silence. I've lost 1 barn. I won't lose the ranch my great-grandfather built. What do you need from us? Over the next 2 hours, they planned their winter defensive strategy, using Ezra's detailed preparations. Each family would maintain normal routines, while implementing security measures that would make covert operations extremely difficult. The radio network would provide constant communication, allowing rapid response to any threats. Most importantly, they would document everything, creating an evidentiary trail that would eventually support criminal prosecutions. But as the families dispersed into the mountain darkness, following routes that would prevent any external observer from determining where they'd been or how many had attended, Silas understood they were crossing a line. They were no longer simply property owners trying to protect their homes. They were becoming something that Blackwood would view as a legitimate threat to their operations. The war Ezra had predicted was moving into a new phase, and Silas found himself wondering if his grandfather's preparations would prove sufficient for the battles ahead. Winter was coming, and with it the real test of everything they'd built. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the valley in 3 feet of pristine white that transformed the landscape into something both beautiful and treacherous. For most folks, heavy snow meant hunkering down until spring, relying on stored supplies and hoping equipment didn't fail when replacement parts were impossible to obtain. For Blackwood Development, it meant the beginning of serious operations. Silas woke to Sarah Chen's voice crackling through the radio before dawn. Multiple vehicles approaching my access road, moving with lights off. Request immediate assistance. He was dressed and moving within minutes, following trails he could navigate blindfolded through timber so dense that daylight barely penetrated even in summer. Snow changed everything about mountain travel, obscuring landmarks, hiding hazards, creating conditions where a single mistake could prove fatal. But it also created opportunities for those who understood how to use winter as an ally rather than fighting it as an enemy. The Chen timber operation sat in a natural wall that could only be approached by a single road during normal conditions. But Silas knew game trails that accessed the property from 3 different directions, routes that would be invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to read the country in all seasons. He reached an observation position above the Chen homestead just as 4 black SUVs finished, surrounding the main buildings. The vehicles were equipped for winter operations, tire chains, auxiliary lighting, communications equipment that suggested serious coordination. But their occupants moved with the awkward uncertainty of people operating in unfamiliar terrain. Through binoculars, Silas counted 12 men in tactical gear, carrying equipment that went far beyond simple surveillance. They had cutting tools, accelerants, devices designed to create the kind of accidents that would be attributed to winter hazards when investigated months later. He keyed his radio using the emergency frequency. All stations, this is base. We have 12 hostiles at Chen Station with incendiary equipment, implementing defensive protocol immediately. The response was swift and coordinated. Within minutes, radio traffic confirmed that network families throughout the valley were reporting similar activity. Multiple vehicle approaches, surveillance teams positioning themselves around key properties, strangers conducting winter safety inspections that provided excuses for detailed reconnaissance. Blackwood had decided to move against the entire network simultaneously, believing that winter isolation would prevent coordinated resistance and allow them to present each incident as an unfortunate accident rather than systematic intimidation. They'd underestimated both the network's communication capabilities and Silas's understanding of winter warfare. Moving carefully through deep snow, he positioned himself where the access road emerged from timber into the cleared area around the Chen buildings. The attackers had left 1 man with their vehicles, standard procedure for maintaining escape routes and communications with their command structure. Silas approached from downhill, using terrain features to remain invisible until he was close enough to act. The guard was focused on radio communications, reporting progress to someone who clearly expected rapid completion of whatever they were planning. Phase 1 complete at all locations, the man was saying. Moving to Phase 2 implementation, Silas stepped from cover with Ezra's Winchester trained on the guard's center mass. Phase 2 is cancelled. The man spun around, hand moving toward a sidearm, then froze when he saw the rifle and understood his situation. Up close, he looked like ex-military, competent, professional, but operating in terrain he didn't understand against opponents he'd underestimated. "Tell your people to withdraw immediately," Silas said quietly. "This is your only warning. You don't understand what you're interfering with," the guard replied. "This is a legitimate business operation with legal authority. At 3 in the morning? With incendiary devices? I don't think so." The radio in the man's hand crackled with reports from other teams. They'd found the Chen house empty. Sarah and her family had evacuated to secure positions as soon as the vehicles were spotted. Similar reports came from other locations as families throughout the valley implemented the defensive protocols Ezra had developed. But the most significant development was the sound of approaching engines. Network families responding to the emergency call, converging on threatened properties using routes that would bring them behind Blackwood's operational teams. "Your 12 men are about to be surrounded by 40 locals who know this country like their own backyards," Silas informed the guard. "They're armed, they're angry about Patterson's barn, and they're not particularly concerned about whether your people make it out of the valley alive." The guard's radio exploded with confused chatter as teams throughout the valley found themselves facing armed resistance from multiple directions. These were professional operators, but they were equipped for standard corporate intimidation, not mountain warfare against people who'd spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. Base to all teams. Abort and withdraw immediately, the guard finally transmitted. Repeat, abort and withdraw. Smart choice, Silas said, but he didn't lower the rifle. Tell your employer that winter operations in this valley are going to be extremely hazardous for his people. We know this country. We're prepared for extended operations, and we're not going anywhere. As the Blackwood teams retreated down mountain roads that were becoming increasingly treacherous, Silas felt a grim satisfaction. They'd won the first real confrontation, proving that the network could respond effectively to coordinated attacks. But he also understood that this victory would escalate the conflict to new levels. Back at the cache, he found a message waiting on the radio from Thomas Whitmore. The lawyer's voice carried new urgency as he reported developments from the legal front. Silas, we've got problems. Blackwood filed emergency injunctions, claiming that armed resistance to their legal operations constitutes domestic terrorism. They're requesting federal intervention under anti-terrorism statutes. The implications hit like a physical blow. If Blackwood could characterize defensive actions as terrorism, they could bring federal resources into the conflict, resources that would overwhelm any local resistance, regardless of legal standing or moral justification. How long do we have? Days, maybe less. They're claiming immediate threat to public safety and requesting expedited hearings. If they succeed, you'll be facing federal marshals instead of corporate security. Silas studied the operational journal, looking for guidance Ezra might have provided for this scenario. What he found was sobering. Detailed analysis of how corporate interests used anti-terrorism legislation to suppress resistance to resource acquisition projects. Your grandfather saw this coming, Whitmore continued. He knew they'd eventually escalate beyond private security to government enforcement. His plans assumed that at some point, you'd need proof of their illegal activities that was so compelling. It would force federal authorities to investigate. Blackwood, instead of prosecuting the resistance, the weight of leadership pressed down on Silas, like the snow accumulating outside the cache. Winter had isolated them from outside support, but it had also provided the perfect cover for Blackwood to escalate their operations. Soon, defending their homes might require actions that would make them federal fugitives. The war for the valley was entering its most dangerous phase. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a young woman named Elena Vasquez, who appeared at the cache during the worst blizzard of the season, traveling on snowshoes through conditions that would have killed most people. She claimed to be a federal investigator, but her knowledge of mountain travel and her ability to find the hidden location suggested connections that went deeper than any government assignment. I worked with your grandfather, she told Silas as she warmed herself by the cache's concealed heating system. Not officially, never officially, but Ezra Creed wasn't the only one who understood what Blackwood development really represents. She produced credentials, identifying her as a special investigator for the Department of Justice, assigned to a task force investigating corporate corruption in federal land management. But more convincingly, she carried a letter in Ezra's handwriting addressed to the federal agent who finally decided to do something about this mess. Your grandfather contacted us 3 years ago, Elena explained. He had evidence of systematic bribery involving Blackwood and federal officials responsible for environmental assessments, water rights allocations, and eminent domain proceedings. We've been building a case, but we needed someone inside Blackwood's operations. She opened a weatherproof case revealing the most significant artifact Silas had encountered, a collection of documents and recordings that exposed the full scope of Blackwood's corruption. Bank records showing payments to federal officials, recorded conversations detailing plans to falsify environmental impact studies. Most damning of all, internal communications discussing the use of private military contractors to resolve situations where legal methods proved insufficient. Blackwood isn't just another development company. Elena continued. They're the domestic acquisition arm of an international consortium that specializes in resource extraction in politically unstable regions. What they're doing in your valley, they've done in South America, Africa, Eastern Europe, anywhere valuable resources exist in areas where local resistance can be neutralized through a combination of corruption and force. Silas studied the documents with growing understanding. The pattern was clear and horrifying, systematic. Exploitation designed to transfer resource, ownership from local communities to international corporations, through methods that stayed just within the boundaries of legal plausibility. Why didn't you move against them sooner? Because they're very good at what they do. Every operation maintains legal cover. Every federal official they corrupt has plausible explanations for their decisions. Every act of intimidation looks like isolated criminal activity rather than systematic policy. We needed proof of coordination, evidence that would hold up in federal court and implicate the entire network. Eleanor pulled out another set of documents, surveillance reports detailing Blackwood's recent escalation in the valley. Your resistance changed everything. Blackwood's response to organized opposition forced them to reveal methods they normally keep hidden. The private military contractors, the systematic surveillance, the coordinated attacks on multiple properties, it's all documented now. By who? By us. We've had agents monitoring Blackwood's operations since your grandfather first made contact. Every illegal action they've taken, every federal regulation they've violated, every corrupt official they've compromised, we have records. The implications were staggering. The resistance hadn't been fighting alone. They'd been providing cover for a federal investigation that could bring down not just Blackwood development, but an entire network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. But we have a problem, Elena continued. Blackwood suspects they're under investigation. They're preparing to liquidate their domestic operations and transfer assets overseas. If they succeed, years of investigative work disappears, and the network adapts to avoid future detection. What do you need? A proof of their most serious crimes. Evidence so compelling that federal prosecutors can move immediately before Blackwood has time to cover their tracks. We need them to commit acts that are so clearly illegal that no amount of political influence can provide protection. Silas understood immediately. You want us to provoke them into escalating beyond anything they can justify. Your grandfather anticipated this scenario. He knew that eventually exposing Blackwood would require forcing them to reveal their true nature. The question is whether you're willing to take that risk. Elena spread out detailed intelligence reports showing Blackwood's current operational status. They have 47 operatives in the region, including 12 former military contractors with extensive combat experience. They're equipped for siege operations and have authorization from corrupted federal officials to use whatever force is necessary to complete their acquisition. Objectives: authorization from which officials? Deputy Director Carson of the Bureau of Land Management, Regional Administrator Phillips of the Environmental Protection Agency, and Federal District Judge Morrison, all receiving monthly payments through offshore accounts. They've provided Blackwood with federal warrants authorizing property seizures under emergency environmental protection statutes. The scope of corruption was breathtaking, but it also provided opportunity. If we can prove federal officials are being bribed to authorize illegal seizures, exactly. But it requires exposing yourselves to extreme danger. Blackwood's next operation will involve federal agents acting under corrupted authority. Resisting them will technically constitute federal crimes, even though the authority itself is illegal. Silas thought about the families in the network, about children who'd grown up in the valley, about elderly folks who'd spent their entire lives building something meaningful in country that demanded everything from those who chose to call it home. They'd already committed themselves to resistance. The question was whether they could survive what would be required to expose the full truth. What's your operational timeline? Blackwood is moving their main force into position tomorrow. They plan to serve federal warrants simultaneously on all resistance properties, using overwhelming force to prevent organized opposition. Once they have physical control, they'll systematically destroy evidence of their illegal activities, while claiming they're conducting federally mandated environmental remediation. And you'll be recording everything? Everything. Audio, video, digital evidence that will prove federal authority was obtained through bribery and used to authorize criminal acts. But Elena, her voice carried new gravity, some of your people might not survive what's coming. Blackwood's contractors have authorization to use lethal force if they encounter armed resistance. The weight of leadership felt heavier than ever as Silas considered what he was being asked to do. Lead his people into a confrontation where they would be outnumbered, outgunned, and technically in violation of federal law, all to provide evidence that might bring justice eventually. But the alternative was watching everything his grandfather had built, everything the families of the valley had worked generations to create, disappear into corporate spreadsheets while the pattern was repeated in valleys across the region. How many federal agents will you have in position? None officially. This operation doesn't exist. If it goes wrong, you'll be facing federal charges with no official support. If it goes right, the evidence we gather will bring down a corruption network that reaches into multiple federal agencies. Outside the cache, the blizzard was intensifying, but Silas could see the clarity of what was required. His grandfather had spent 40 years preparing for this moment, not just to resist Blackwood, but to expose the system that made Blackwood possible. When do we start? Elena smiled grimly. Your grandfather said you'd say that. He left specific instructions for what he called the final gambit, operational. Plans designed to force Blackwood into actions so extreme that no amount of political cover could protect them. She handed him a sealed envelope marked for Silas, when everything depends on courage. Inside, Ezra's final letter began. Boy, if you're reading this, then the time for half measures is over. Ezra's final letter contained operational plans so detailed and audacious that Silas understood why his grandfather had waited until the very end to reveal them. The strategy wasn't just about defending individual properties. It was about turning Blackwood's overwhelming force against itself, using their own tactics to expose the corruption that made their operations possible. The enemy's greatest strength becomes their greatest weakness, Ezra had written. When you force them to reveal it in circumstances they can't control. They've built their power on secrecy and legal cover. Strip away both, and they become just another criminal organization. Operating on federal land, the plan required splitting Blackwood's forces across multiple targets while concentrating the resistance at a single location, where their illegal methods would be impossible to conceal. More importantly, it required sacrifice. Some families would have to abandon their properties temporarily to make the strategy work. Silas called an emergency gathering using the radio network, knowing it might be the last time they could communicate freely before federal monitoring equipment made coordination impossible. The families arrived at the cache through conditions that would have deterred anyone less committed, their faces showing the strain of weeks under siege, but also the determination that came from understanding they were fighting for something larger than individual survival. Blackwood is moving their main force. Tomorrow, he announced, sharing Elena's intelligence without revealing her identity or federal involvement. 47 operatives with federal warrants, equipped for siege operations and authorized to use lethal force. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Mary Miller spoke first, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were facing. How do we fight federal warrants? By proving they were obtained through bribery and corruption, Silas replied. But it requires exposing ourselves to extreme danger while gathering evidence that might not save us in time to matter. He spread out Ezra's final operational plan. showing how the network's defensive preparations could be transformed into an offensive strategy designed to force Blackwood into revealing their true nature. The plan was brilliant and terrifying. It would work, but only if everyone was willing to risk everything. Patterson studied the details with obvious concern. This assumes they'll respond to resistance by escalating to methods they can't legally justify. What if they just withdraw and try again later? They can, Silas explained. Elena's intelligence indicates they're under pressure from their international backers to complete operations before federal investigations force them to abandon domestic activities. They've invested too much to walk away now. Sarah Chen pointed to the tactical positions marked on Ezra's maps. These defensive points, they're designed to channel attackers into specific approaches where their actions would be completely visible to outside observation. Exactly. But it means abandoning most of our properties and concentrating our defense at a single location where we'll be completely outnumbered. The families studied the plan in silence, understanding that what Silas was proposing went far beyond property defense. They would be making themselves targets in order to expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of federal government. Success would vindicate their resistance and protect communities throughout the region. Failure would likely mean federal prosecution for those who survived. Tom Whitmore's voice crackled through the radio from his legal office in Helena. Silas, I've been monitoring federal communications. Blackwood's warrants authorize property seizures under emergency environmental protection statutes. Technically, any resistance constitutes federal crimes punishable by up to 20 years in prison, unless we can prove the warrants were obtained illegally. Silas replied, "That's a legal argument for courts to decide after the fact. It won't protect you during the confrontation itself." Mary Miller stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made difficult decisions in harsh country for decades. "My family's been in this valley for 4 generations. My grandfather homesteaded during the Panic of 1893, built something that lasted through the Depression, 2 world wars, and every boom and bust since. I won't be the generation that loses it to corporate raiders, regardless of what authority they claim." One by one, the other families voiced similar commitments. These were people who understood that some things were worth the ultimate sacrifice, that sometimes the only way to preserve what mattered was to risk losing everything. Elena's intelligence proved accurate, as scattered reports throughout the evening confirmed Blackwood's final preparations. Helicopter flights bringing additional personnel, supply convoys moving up mountain roads despite dangerous conditions, communications equipment being positioned for coordination of simultaneous operations across the entire valley. But the resistance had advantages that corporate planners couldn't quantify. They knew every trail, every defensive position, every weather pattern that could affect operations in the high country. More importantly, they were fighting for their homes while Blackwood's operatives were following orders in unfamiliar terrain during conditions that tested even experienced mountain fighters. As midnight approached, families began implementing the evacuation phase of Ezra's plan. Properties throughout the valley were abandoned with careful preparation. Valuable items secured, essential systems shut down, evidence of illegal surveillance preserved for eventual legal proceedings. But the evacuations weren't random. Retreats. They followed specific routes designed to concentrate defensive strength at the location Ezra had chosen for the final confrontation. The Miller homestead occupied a natural bottleneck where the main valley narrowed between steep ridges. Approaches were limited and easily observed. More importantly, it sat directly above Blackwood's forward operating base, making their illegal activities visible to anyone positioned on the surrounding heights. Silas established his command post in a concealed position that overlooked both the homestead and Blackwood's staging area. From here, he could coordinate defensive operations while observing enemy activities that would provide evidence of their illegal methods. Elena had positioned recording equipment throughout the area, devices that would capture everything for eventual federal prosecution. But as he studied the tactical situation through night vision equipment, Silas understood that legal victory might come too late to save the people fighting for it. Blackwood's forces were professional and well-equipped. The resistance consisted of farmers and ranchers whose only military experience came from hunting and occasional law enforcement. Encounters. The radio crackled with final reports as families reached their assigned positions. Chen family in position at Overlook. 2. Patterson group established at Ridge Station. Miller clan ready at the homestead. 23. Adults and 6 teenagers spread across defensive positions that Ezra had prepared over decades against 47 professional operatives with federal authority and unlimited resources. Elena's voice came through on the secure frequency she'd established. Federal monitoring confirms Blackwood has authorization to use whatever force is necessary. Their operational orders assume they're dealing with domestic terrorists armed with military-grade weapons. Are we? Patterson asked from his ridge position. Silas thought about Ezra's carefully maintained weapons cache, about the military tactics his grandfather had studied, about the operational plans that assumed eventual armed confrontation with overwhelming force. "We're families defending our homes," he replied. "Everything else is what they choose to make it." Dawn was still hours away when the first helicopters appeared, their rotors barely audible above the mountain wind. Blackwood was moving early, hoping to catch the resistance unprepared and minimize their ability to coordinate defensive actions. But Ezra's plans had anticipated pre-dawn operations. The families were already in position, already coordinating through communication systems that couldn't be monitored or jammed, already implementing strategies designed to turn Blackwood's advantages against them. "All stations, this is base," Silas transmitted. "Enemy forces approaching from multiple directions. Implement defensive protocol and remember, we're not trying to win a military engagement. We're trying to force them to reveal their true nature where the whole world can see it." The battle for the valley was about to begin, and with it, the test of whether Ezra Creed's 40 years of preparation would prove sufficient to preserve what he'd spent his life building. Through his binoculars, Silas watched federal agents and corporate mercenaries taking positions around the Miller homestead, their movements coordinated and professional. In a few hours, the entire network would be facing the full weight of corrupted federal authority, backed by overwhelming force. But they would face it together, as Ezra had always intended, with the truth as their weapon and justice as their objective. The final gambit had begun. The attack began at 4:30 in the morning with the systematic precision of a military operation. 3 helicopters swept into the valley from different directions, their searchlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as ground teams moved into position around the Miller homestead. Federal agents in tactical gear approached with the confidence of people who'd done this many times before, expecting to encounter scattered resistance from unprepared civilians. They found something entirely different. Silas watched through night vision scopes as the lead team approached the main house, their movements coordinated but predictable. Ezra's defensive preparations had anticipated exactly this kind of operation. Overwhelming force designed to crush resistance before it could organize effectively. But the old man had also understood that sometimes the best defense was allowing your enemy to reveal their true nature. "Federal agents, we have warrants for property seizure under Emergency Environmental Protection Authority. Exit the building with your hands visible." The amplified voice echoed across the valley, carrying clearly to the recording equipment Elena had positioned throughout the area. Every word would be documented, every action preserved for eventual legal proceedings. But legal vindication would come too late to save anyone who didn't survive the next few hours. Mary Miller's voice crackled through the radio from inside the house. "They're demanding immediate surrender with threats of lethal force if we resist." "Should I respond?" "Negative," Silas replied. "Let them escalate on their own timeline. We're documenting everything." The federal agents waited exactly 90 seconds before implementing what was clearly a predetermined escalation procedure. Flashbang grenades shattered windows, while tactical teams stormed the building from multiple entry points. The violence was swift and overwhelming, exactly the kind of operation designed to break resistance through shock and intimidation. But the house was empty. Mary Miller and her family had evacuated hours earlier, following protocols Ezra had developed for exactly this scenario. The agents found abandoned rooms and cold coffee, evidence of recent habitation, but no people to arrest or intimidate. "Base, this is Team Leader," came the frustrated voice over Blackwood's communication frequency. "Target location is abandoned. No subjects present for warrant service." "Expand the search perimeter," replied a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders without question. "Environmental hazards require immediate remediation, regardless of current occupancy status." What followed revealed the true nature of Blackwood's operations. Instead of withdrawing when they found no environmental violations, the agents began systematically destroying everything of value: family photographs, handmade furniture, tools accumulated over generations of mountain living. They weren't conducting environmental assessments. They were making continued residence impossible. Elena's recording equipment captured everything as agents used thermite charges to destroy the house's heating system, contaminated the well with industrial chemicals, and demolished outbuildings that had stood for over a century. The systematic destruction had nothing to do with environmental protection, and everything to do with forcing abandonment through methodical devastation. Jesus Christ! Patterson's voice came through the radio from his observation position. "They're not serving warrants. They're conducting a military demolition operation." But the real revelation came when Blackwood's mercenaries arrived. While federal agents provided legal cover, private military contractors began implementing operations that no federal authority could justify. They planted explosives throughout the property, prepared incendiary devices designed to create the appearance of accidental fires, and established communication equipment for coordinating similar operations at other locations. Silas keyed his radio to Elena's secure frequency. "Are you getting this? Every second of it. They're using federal authority to cover systematic destruction that goes far beyond any legitimate warrant. This is exactly what we needed." Through his scopes, Silas watched as Harrison Blackwood himself arrived by helicopter, surveying the destruction with obvious satisfaction. The man who'd made the original offer now stood amid the ruins of a family's life work, directing operations with the casual indifference of someone who'd done this many times before. "Phase 1 complete," Blackwood reported to someone via satellite phone. "Property neutralized and prepared for transfer." Implementing Phase 2 at remaining locations, that was when Silas understood the full scope of what they were facing. This wasn't about his grandfather's property or even the valley's water rights. Blackwood was conducting a coordinated operation designed to empty the entire region of resistant populations, clearing the way for resource extraction on a massive scale. The radio erupted with reports from other locations as similar operations began throughout the valley. Helicopters approaching Chen Station. Federal agents surrounding Patterson Ridge. Multiple teams moving on Overlook. Positions. Ezra's final gambit was working. Blackwood was revealing their illegal methods in circumstances that couldn't be concealed or denied. But it was also putting every member of the resistance in mortal danger as they faced overwhelming force while gathering evidence that might not save them in time to matter. "All stations," Silas transmitted, "implement Phase 2 defensive protocols. Remember, we're not trying to stop them. We're trying to survive long enough to expose them." The battle was moving into its most dangerous phase, and Silas found himself hoping that his grandfather's faith in justice would prove stronger than Blackwood's faith in overwhelming force. The resistance's coordinated response began at dawn as Blackwood's forces discovered they weren't fighting scattered homesteaders, but a network that had been preparing for this confrontation for decades. Sarah Chen's voice came through the radio with deadly calm as federal agents approached her family's timber operation. They're using the same playbook: flashbangs, tactical entry, systematic destruction. But we're ready for them. Ezra's defensive preparations proved their worth as families. Throughout the valley, implemented strategies designed to make Blackwood's operations as visible and legally indefensible as possible. Instead of hiding or fighting directly, they forced every illegal action into the open, where Elena's recording equipment captured evidence that would destroy careers and send people to federal prison. At the Patterson Ranch, the family had prepared a surprise that revealed the true nature of Blackwood's environmental claims. When agents arrived to conduct their hazardous material assessment, they found detailed environmental surveys proving the property exceeded federal standards for water quality, soil stability, and wildlife habitat protection. Every claim in their warrant was demonstrably false. "Base, this is Patterson Station." Jim's voice carried grim satisfaction. "They're destroying property that their own environmental assessments prove is pristine. Elena's cameras are getting everything, but Blackwood's response to documented evidence of their fraud was escalation rather than withdrawal." Harrison Blackwood's voice crackled over their communication frequency with new urgency as reports came in from throughout the valley. "All teams, implement scorched earth protocols immediately. Legal complications require accelerated timeline completion." Silas felt ice form in his chest as he understood what Blackwood was ordering. They weren't just destroying individual properties anymore. They were implementing a strategy designed to eliminate everyone who could testify about what they'd witnessed. The first indication came when helicopter gunships appeared over the valley, military aircraft that had no legitimate role in environmental enforcement. Their presence revealed that Blackwood had escalated beyond federal authority to methods that could only be justified by claiming they were facing armed insurrection. "All stations," Silas transmitted urgently, "we have military aircraft inbound. They're moving beyond intimidation to elimination. Implement emergency protocols immediately." Elena's voice cut through the radio chatter with desperate urgency. "Silas, they're jamming federal communication frequencies. My backup teams can't reach Justice Department headquarters. We're on our own until this is over." The realization hit like a physical blow. Blackwood had moved beyond corruption to open warfare, gambling that they could eliminate all witnesses before federal authorities could intervene. The resistance wasn't just fighting for their properties anymore. They were fighting for their lives. But Ezra's final preparations included contingencies for exactly this scenario. Hidden throughout the valley were weapons caches, communication equipment, and defensive positions that could withstand military assault. More importantly, the old man had anticipated that ultimate victory would require surviving long enough for truth to reach the outside world. "All families, withdraw to alpha positions," Silas ordered. "This is no longer about gathering evidence. This is about survival." The helicopter gunships began systematic attacks on every resistance position, using military-grade weapons against American citizens on American soil. But Ezra's defensive planning had anticipated air assault, positioning families in locations that provided natural protection while forcing attacking aircraft into patterns that revealed their illegal military operations. Elena's recording equipment captured everything, federal agents coordinating with military contractors to conduct combat operations against civilians. Helicopter gunships destroying homes with no legal justification. Systematic execution of plans that violated every principle of constitutional law. But the resistance's greatest weapon proved to be something Blackwood couldn't neutralize: the moral courage of ordinary people who refused to surrender. What their families had spent generations building. At the Chen timber operation, 3 generations of the family held defensive positions while federal agents destroyed everything their ancestors had created. At Patterson Ranch, Jim and his sons documented every illegal action while protecting evidence that would eventually convict their attackers. The turning point came when Mary Miller made a decision that would define the battle's outcome. Instead of retreating to safety, she returned to her destroyed homestead and began broadcasting over civilian emergency frequencies, describing in clear, calm terms exactly what federal agents were doing under false authority. This is Mary Miller at Miller Ranch in Timber Valley. Federal agents claiming environmental authority are conducting military operations against American families defending their homes. They're using military aircraft to destroy properties their own surveys prove are environmentally sound. This is not law enforcement. This is corporate warfare being conducted under false federal authority. Her broadcast reached emergency services throughout the region, creating a chain reaction as law enforcement agencies that weren't compromised began demanding explanations for military operations in their jurisdictions. Media outlets picked up the emergency transmissions, forcing Blackwood's political allies to either openly support military action against civilians or begin distancing themselves from operations. They could no longer deny. Silas watched through his scopes as Harrison Blackwood received increasingly frantic communications from his political contacts. The man who'd arrived with such confidence was now facing the collapse of everything his organization had built. As their illegal methods were exposed in real time to audiences they couldn't silence or control, but victory would mean nothing if none of them survived to see justice served. The helicopter gunships were still circling, still attacking, still implementing orders to eliminate everyone who could testify about what they'd witnessed. The final phase of Ezra's gambit was about to begin. The final confrontation ended not with gunfire, but with the arrival of legitimate federal authorities who'd been racing toward the valley since Mary Miller's emergency broadcast reached the Attorney General's office. FBI helicopters appeared over the ridgeline just as Blackwood's gunships were positioning for what would have been a final assault on the resistance positions. What followed was the kind of standoff that ends careers and destroys political alliances. Federal agents loyal to the Constitution faced off against federal agents corrupted by corporate money, while military contractors found themselves surrounded by legitimate law enforcement demanding explanations for combat operations. On American soil, Harrison Blackwood's empire collapsed in real time as Elena's evidence reached prosecutors who'd been waiting years for proof of the corruption network. Bank records, recorded conversations, and video documentation of illegal military operations created an evidentiary chain that no amount of political influence could break. Silas watched from his observation position as the man who'd threatened his inheritance was led away in federal custody, his confident demeanor replaced by the desperate calculations of someone who understood his organization had been completely exposed. The corporate raiders who'd seemed so powerful just hours earlier were now facing decades in federal prison, but victory came at a cost that would be measured in more than damaged buildings and destroyed equipment. The Miller homestead was gone, burned to its foundation by federal agents acting under corrupted authority. Patterson's barn, rebuilt after the first arson attack, was destroyed again by helicopter gunships. Sarah Chen's timber operation bore scars that would take decades to heal. Yet as the families emerged from their defensive positions, Silas saw something in their faces that convinced him Ezra's sacrifice had been worthwhile. They'd faced overwhelming force and survived. More importantly, they'd proven that ordinary people could still defend what mattered when they were willing to stand together. The legal aftermath unfolded over months as federal prosecutors dismantled the corruption network that had made Blackwood's operations possible. Deputy Director Carson of the Bureau of Land Management received a 20-year sentence for accepting bribes to falsify environmental assessments. Regional Administrator Phillips faced similar charges for authorizing illegal property seizures. Federal District Judge Morrison was impeached and removed from office for selling judicial decisions to corporate interests. But the most significant victory was the precedent established for protecting property rights against corporate acquisition schemes. The Timber Valley case became the foundation for federal legislation that closed loopholes, allowing environmental regulations to be weaponized against small landowners. Thomas Whitmore helped Silas navigate the complex legal process of rebuilding after the confrontation. Federal compensation for damages covered reconstruction costs, but more importantly, the legal victory established clear protections for the knowledge and traditions Ezra had spent his life preserving. The cache became the foundation for something new, a training center where families throughout the region could learn the skills necessary for self-reliant living in mountain country. Ezra's journals were compiled into educational materials that preserved traditional knowledge while adapting it for modern challenges. Elena Vasquez visited the valley 6 months after the confrontation, bringing news that the investigation had expanded to expose similar operations in 12 other states. The network that had seemed so powerful had proven surprisingly fragile once there. Illegal methods were fully documented. Your grandfather understood something that took me years to learn, she told Silas as they stood on the rebuilt porch of the family house. Corruption depends on secrecy. Force it into the light, and it destroys itself. The rebuilt homes were different from what had been destroyed, more modern in some ways, but incorporating defensive features and communication systems that would make future resistance more effective if it ever became necessary. The families had learned that the price of freedom was constant vigilance, but they'd also learned they could pay that price when they stood together. Mary Miller's new house included a memorial room dedicated to preserving the history of their resistance. Photographs, documents, and artifacts from the confrontation served as reminders that ordinary people could still defend extraordinary things when they were willing to risk everything that mattered. Silas found his grandfather's final letter waiting in the rebuilt cache, placed there by Elena as part of the evidence restoration process. The envelope was marked for after the victory, and its contents revealed the depth of Ezra's faith in his grandson's ability to carry forward what he'd started. Boy, if you're reading this, then you've learned what I spent 40 years trying to teach you, that some things are worth more than individual survival, that knowledge preserved is hope maintained, and that communities built on shared purpose can withstand any storm. The letter continued with practical instructions for using the legal victory to build something lasting. Water rights secured through the court victory would be held in trust for future generations. Traditional knowledge preserved in the journals would be taught to anyone willing to learn. The defensive network would be maintained not for war, but for the kind of mutual support that helped families thrive in difficult country. But the final paragraph revealed the true scope of Ezra's vision for his inheritance. I didn't leave you land, boy. I left you purpose. Use what you've learned to help others learn what they need to know. Build something that will last not just through your lifetime, but through your children's children's lifetimes. Show them that there's still room in this world for people who understand that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in knowledge, capability, and the strength that comes from knowing you belong to something larger than yourself. 6 months later, Silas stood in the same spot where he'd first read his grandfather's journals, watching children from families throughout the valley learn skills their ancestors had taken for granted. The traditional knowledge Ezra had preserved was being passed to a new generation that would carry it forward into an uncertain future. The inheritance was complete. Not just land and buildings, but purpose and community, and the understanding that some things were worth preserving, regardless of the cost. Ezra Creed's mountain had been defended, but more importantly, his vision of what life could be when people chose to build rather than simply consume had taken root in fertile ground. The legacy would continue, carried forward by those who understood that the greatest inheritance was the knowledge of how to build something worth leaving to the next generation.